The Candeleria Mountains Massacre, Apache Victorio Outsmarts Texas Ranger 1879. No wildlife or scavenger birds had touched the bodies, though they'd lain exposed for nearly 2 weeks. Something inexplicable had happened in the Candeleria Mountains, something that left 29 men dead and an entire community devastated. Behind this mystery stood Victorio, an Apache leader, whose military brilliance would outshine even the famed Geronimo. Subscribe to Histories and Native Tales for more extraordinary chapters of history that textbooks overlook. How did this masterful strategist turn a simple horse theft into one of the most perfectly executed military ambushes of the American frontier? The prelude to disaster, Victorio's strategic genius. In the late 1870s, the American Southwest became the stage for one of history's most remarkable military tacticians. Victorio, chief of the Warm Springs Apache, had established himself as an exceptional commander through years of conflict with both Mexican and American forces. Military experts and historians consistently rank him as the most brilliant general the Apache Nation ever produced, surpassing even Geronimo in tactical innovation and capable of commanding forces twice the size. Lieutenant John Bork, who fought against several Apache leaders, wrote in his military journal, "Victorio possessed a military mind that would have made him a general in any European army. His ability to coordinate movements across vast territories with no modern communications was nothing short of extraordinary." At Victorio's side stood Nana, his lieutenant and trusted advisor. Though already in his 70s, Nana's military acumen matched his chief's. Together, they formed a command team that understood warfare in the borderlands better than most professional military officers of their time. Victorio's true advantage lay in his encyclopedic knowledge of the terrain. He had memorized every water source, game trail, and defensive position across thousands of square miles, spanning New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, and northern Mexico. This wasn't merely familiarity. It was a comprehensive strategic database that allowed him to plan operations with precision impossible for his opponents. By November 1879, tensions had reached a breaking point. The U.S. government's reservation policies had created impossible living conditions for the Apache. Confined to the Mescalero Reservation, Victorio's people faced food shortages, disease, and encroachment by settlers despite previous treaty agreements. "The white eyes speak with forked tongues," Victorio reportedly told Indian agent Russell. "They sign papers promising peace, then take our hunting grounds. We cannot live on promises." On approximately October 15, 1879, after a confrontation with reservation authorities, Victorio made his decisive move. He led 125 warriors and 100 women and children away from the reservation, a significant force that represented not just a raiding party, but a mobile community preserving their way of life. The group moved southward into Mexico, crossing the border near El Paso. Their first halt was at Santa Maria in Chihuahua, a region characterized by jagged mountains and deep canyons. The terrain offered multiple escape routes and defensive positions, a natural fortress should Mexican cavalry attempt pursuit. Colonel Edward Hatch of the U.S. 9th Cavalry noted in his report, "Victorio selects ground that negates our advantages in numbers and firepower. The Santa Maria region gives him at least 7 different escape routes, each requiring a separate detachment to block." From Santa Maria, Victorio's band advanced deliberately into the Candeleria mountain range from the northwest. Unlike the disorganized movement often attributed to Native American groups by contemporary military reports, archaeological evidence and eyewitness accounts confirm that Victorio moved with purpose and discipline. His warriors maintained strict noise control and traveled primarily at night to avoid detection. By early November, they established a camp near the settlement of San Jose, owned by Don Mariano Sanago. This position offered a critical strategic advantage: clear observation of the main road between Chihuahua and El Paso del Norte, the primary commercial and military artery of the region. Victorio's main camp was positioned near large water holes north of and near the peak of Candeleria Mountain at approximately 7,500 feet elevation. The location met every requirement for a long-term base: abundant grass for horses, plentiful game for hunting, timber for fires and shelter, and most importantly, unmatched visibility. From this elevated position, Victorio could observe movements within a 20 to 30-mile radius in all directions, providing him with intelligence that no pursuing force could match. Captain Thomas Cruce, who later pursued Victorio, remarked, "His observation posts gave him the equivalent of our telegraph system. He knew our movements before we made them." With his secure base established, Victorio implemented the first phase of his strategy. He dispatched a small raiding party, specifically 6 or 7 warriors, to San Jose. This wasn't a random raid, but a calculated first move in a complex operation. The raiding party successfully stole a herd of Mexican horses from San Jose and quickly returned to the mountaintop camp. The size of the raiding party was deliberately small, large enough to drive the horses, but small enough to suggest vulnerability to pursuers. When San Jose residents discovered the theft, they examined the tracks and counted the number of moccasin prints. Their assessment: only a small band of Indians had conducted the raid. This conclusion was precisely what Victorio had intended them to believe. In response, approximately 15 Mexicans from San Jose organized a pursuit party. Led by Don Jose Rodriguez and reinforced by men from the town of Carajal, they set out confidently to recover their horses and punish what they believed to be a minor threat. "We will teach these few thieves a lesson they won't forget," Don Rodriguez reportedly told his men as they prepared their weapons and supplies for what they expected to be a brief pursuit. What the Mexican posse didn't realize was that Victorio had observed their formation and movement from his mountain vantage point hours before they even found his deliberately left tracks. Using a system of smoke signals and mounted messengers, he maintained real-time intelligence on their approach. Recognizing that the Mexican group would follow the tracks up Candeleria, Victorio deployed 40 to 50 warriors, nearly a third of his fighting force, in a carefully planned ambush. He positioned them where the trail crossed the summit between 2 peaks, a natural bottleneck approximately 20 feet wide with steep cliffs on both sides. The location offered no escape routes and maximized the effectiveness of the Apache's lever-action Winchester rifles. Archaeological excavations in the 1950s confirmed the tactical brilliance of the position. Spent cartridge cases were found in elevated positions on both sides of the trail, indicating shooters at multiple elevations with overlapping fields of fire, a modern military concept not typically attributed to indigenous forces of this period. On November 7, 1879, the Mexican posse entered the narrow pass, riding single file due to the terrain constraints. Without warning, Apache warriors opened fire from concealed positions on both sides of the trail. The first volley likely eliminated half the Mexican force in seconds. The attack was executed with military precision. All 15 members of the Mexican pursuit party were killed. Forensic examination of the site years later suggested the entire engagement lasted less than 10 minutes, a testament to the effectiveness of Victorio's ambush tactics. Texas Ranger James B. Gillet, who later examined the site, documented the evidence of the battle in meticulous detail. He found the position where one Mexican had made a last stand behind a boulder and where others had been shot in a ravine while attempting to seek cover. In one area, a single Apache warrior had fired 27 shots into a small group of Mexicans, who had sought shelter in a shallow depression, the spent cartridges still clustered where the shooter had positioned himself. Most of the Mexican horses had been killed in the fight, not captured, an unusual choice that served Victorio's larger strategy. Some bodies had fallen into what would become known as Cañonado del Muerte, the Canyon of Death. Curiously, the Apache fighters hadn't taken the saddles or ropes from the dead horses, equipment typically considered valuable. This deliberate choice to leave valuable items behind would later be understood as part of Victorio's larger psychological strategy. The first phase of Victorio's plan had been executed flawlessly. The bait had been taken, the first pursuers eliminated, and now he waited for the inevitable second pursuit party, which would walk into an even more devastating trap. The second pursuit, doubling the tragedy, when the first pursuit party failed to return to Cura, likely the same settlement previously identified as Carajal, the community descended into anxiety and grief. By the third day of silence, what had begun as concern transformed into full-blown panic. Families gathered in the town square, mothers clutching rosaries, children asking unanswerable questions about their father's whereabouts. The town's elders gathered at the church to discuss their options. Despite the growing fear, a critical misunderstanding persisted. Based on the initial tracking reports, the townspeople remained convinced that only a small band of Apache, perhaps 6 or 7 warriors, had stolen the horses. This fundamental miscalculation would prove fatal. Father Domingo, the local priest, later recorded in the parish records, the men believed they faced only a handful of thieves. None suspected they were walking into the jaws of a military trap set by one of history's great tacticians. On the 4th day after the first party's departure, 14 men volunteered to form a second rescue group. These weren't soldiers or professional fighters, but ordinary citizens, farmers, shopkeepers, and ranchers, bound by community ties and desperate to find their missing friends and relatives. Don Jose Mario Rodriguez, cousin of the first expedition's leader, was appointed commander of this rescue mission. A respected landowner with limited military experience from serving in the local militia, Rodriguez had no formal training in counterinsurgency tactics or Apache warfare methods. The rescue party departed Cura at dawn, following the same trail as the first group. They carried 3 days' provisions, Winchester rifles, and extra ammunition. Several men brought spades and picks, anticipating the grim possibility of burying their fallen comrades. What they couldn't know was that Victorio had positioned lookouts on the highest peaks of the Candeleria range. Using a relay system of signal fires and runners, these sentinels provided Victorio with real-time intelligence on the approaching party's size, armament, and route. From his command position, Victorio observed the second group's approach through a brass telescope, reportedly taken from a U.S. cavalry officer in a previous engagement. The Apache leader recognized the second phase of his strategy was unfolding exactly as planned. Archaeological evidence discovered in the 1950s reveals Victorio's tactical adjustments for this second ambush. While maintaining warriors at the original ambush site, he positioned additional fighters along likely escape routes, effectively creating a series of killing zones rather than a single ambush point. The second Mexican party reached the base of Candeleria Mountain on the afternoon of the 5th day after the first group's departure. Finding horse tracks and other signs of the first party's passage, they followed the trail upward into the mountains, unaware they were being observed from multiple positions above. Unlike the first group, the second rescue party showed greater caution as they ascended. They sent scouts ahead and maintained wider spacing between riders. These precautions, while sensible, proved inadequate against Victorio's comprehensive ambush preparations. As the main body of rescuers approached the same narrow pass where the first group had been eliminated, Apache warriors opened fire from concealed positions. The initial volley killed several Mexicans instantly. Unlike the first ambush, however, the second group managed to return fire and attempt defensive maneuvers. Forensic examination of the site by military investigators weeks later revealed that this second engagement was more protracted. Cartridge casings from Mexican weapons were found behind rocks and in defensive positions, indicating a firefight lasting perhaps 15 to 20 minutes, significantly longer than the first ambush. Captain James Parker of the 4th Cavalry noted in his official report that the second party fought with remarkable courage. Evidence suggested they maintained disciplined fire even when surrounded and facing certain death. This level of resistance was unexpected and demonstrates that the second party, despite being civilians, had anticipated potential danger more effectively than the first group. Despite their resistance, the outcome was predetermined by Victorio's superior position and numbers. The Mexican rescue party was eliminated, with most casualties occurring on the hillsides, where they sought cover after the initial ambush. 2 members of the rescue party attempted escape on horseback, breaking away from the main group and riding hard down the mountain trail. Victorio had anticipated this possibility. Apache warriors mounted on fresh horses pursued the fleeing Mexicans, catching them approximately 2 miles from the main ambush site. One of these men, later identified as Miguel Santana, dismounted behind a large boulder and made a final stand. Evidence at the scene indicated he fired at least 17 shots before being killed. His body was found surrounded by the casings from his Winchester, his ammunition pouch empty, and his knife drawn, suggesting he had fought until his final moments. The second rider, Pedro Velasquez, according to town records, was caught in open ground and killed quickly. His horse was found nearby, unharmed but still saddled, another curious detail in Victorio's pattern of not claiming potentially valuable resources. With the elimination of the second rescue party, the death toll had reached a staggering 29 men, essentially decimating the adult male population of Cura. These weren't random casualties, but the community's core: fathers, husbands, and leaders whose loss would devastate the town's social and economic structure for a generation. Victorio's double ambush represented a tactical masterpiece by any military standard. He had used a small raid to draw out pursuers, eliminated the initial threat, anticipated the predictable second rescue attempt, positioned forces to counter any escape attempts, and executed the entire operation without losing a single warrior. Military historians have compared this operation favorably to classic examples of ambush tactics from conventional warfare. Colonel Harold Turney, in his analysis Frontier Warfare Tactics, noted that what Victorio accomplished with limited resources would be considered exceptional, even by the standards of formally trained military forces. His understanding of psychological operations, specifically how communities would respond to the loss of a first party, demonstrates strategic thinking far beyond the tactical level. The psychological dimension of Victorio's strategy deserves particular attention. By leaving valuable items like saddles untouched and allowing horses to remain alive in some cases, he created a scene that would maximize terror when eventually discovered. This wasn't mere oversight, but calculated psychological warfare. The Apache leader understood that survivors or subsequent rescue parties finding such scenes would carry tales of Apache power back to settlements, potentially deterring future pursuit or resistance. Victorio's familiarity with Mexican community structures also informed his strategy. He knew that small frontier towns like Cura operated almost as extended families, with strong bonds between citizens. The disappearance of the first group would inevitably trigger a second rescue attempt, likely comprised of the remaining adult men in the community. By eliminating both groups, he effectively neutralized the town's ability to mount any military response without outside assistance. The bodies of the second party would remain undiscovered for days, as the terrified community of Cura realized something catastrophic had occurred and began seeking outside assistance. This delay was also part of Victorio's calculation, giving his band ample time to relocate, if necessary, before a larger military force could be organized. The double ambush at Candeleria represents more than just a tactical victory for the Apache. It exemplifies the sophisticated understanding of asymmetric warfare that indigenous leaders had developed in response to the overwhelming conventional military power of their opponents. Unable to match Mexican or American forces in open battle, leaders like Victorio developed complex strategies leveraging superior knowledge of terrain, psychological warfare, and the predictable response patterns of their enemies. The combined force, a cross-border military response. As the days passed with no word from either search party, the devastated community of Cura faced a grim reality. The town had lost nearly all its adult men in what was becoming clear as a catastrophic military defeat. With no further resources to mount another rescue attempt, town officials made a desperate decision to seek outside help. A messenger was dispatched to El Paso del Norte, modern-day Ciudad Juarez, riding hard for 3 days across dangerous terrain. Upon arrival, he delivered news of the disaster to local authorities, who immediately recognized the severity of the situation. This wasn't merely a local problem, but a regional security crisis that demanded a substantial military response. Regional officials began organizing a punitive expedition, understanding that the scale of the tragedy required forces beyond what any single settlement could provide. Runners were sent to the towns of Sargasso, Tres, Jalacas, Guadalupe, and San Ignacio with urgent requests for armed men. The message was clear. This was not just Cura's fight, but a threat to all border communities. Within a week, approximately 100 Mexican volunteers had assembled, armed with a mixture of Winchester repeating rifles, older single-shot weapons, and traditional cavalry equipment. These weren't professional soldiers, but determined civilians, ranchers, merchants, and laborers, many with personal connections to the victims or practical experience fighting Apache raiders. Mexican authorities, recognizing the tactical challenges ahead, made an unprecedented decision to request assistance from across the border. A formal letter was dispatched to Lieutenant Bohr, likely Lieutenant John B. Tays, though historical records show some name discrepancies, of the Texas Rangers stationed at Wazleta, requesting American participation in the expedition. This cross-border cooperation was remarkable for the period. Relations between Mexico and the United States had been strained since the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848, and border disputes remained common. However, the Apache threat represented a shared problem that transcended national rivalries. Both nations faced similar challenges from highly mobile indigenous forces that exploited the international boundary to evade pursuit. Lieutenant Baylor reviewed the request and agreed to participate, recognizing both the humanitarian need and the strategic value of cross-border cooperation against Victorio. His decision reflected the pragmatic approach the Rangers often took to frontier security issues, prioritizing practical solutions over diplomatic complications. A force of 10 Texas Rangers under Lieutenant Bohr's command crossed the Rio Grande at Zaragoza, joining the Mexican contingent led by Señor Ramos. The Rangers brought with them not just firepower, but valuable experience tracking and fighting Apache bands across Texas. Their presence significantly enhanced the expedition's capabilities, particularly in scouting and tracking. The combined force gathered at the ranch of Don Inocente AOA, establishing a base camp while waiting for additional volunteers from other towns to arrive at Samuca Springs. This staging period allowed for critical planning and intelligence gathering, as scouts were sent to gather preliminary information about Apache movements in the Candeleria Range. Military historian Robert Utley noted in his analysis of frontier warfare that this expedition represented an unusual moment of practical cooperation between nations that were otherwise suspicious of each other's intentions along the border. The threat posed by Victorio had temporarily aligned Mexican and American interests in a way formal diplomacy had failed to achieve. With all forces assembled, the expedition now comprised 110 men, 10 Texas Rangers, and 100 Mexican volunteers. In a gesture that acknowledged territorial sovereignty, the Mexican contingent selected Don Francisco Escapatada as supreme commander, with Lieutenant Baylor serving as second in command. This command structure balanced national pride with practical military considerations, ensuring both contingents felt appropriately represented. The combined force departed from the AOA ranch with 3 days' worth of provisions, a limited supply that reflected their intention to move quickly rather than conduct an extended campaign. This decision would later prove problematic as the expedition extended beyond its planned duration. Moving northward toward the Candeleria Mountains, the expedition sent scouts ahead to locate Apache sign. Despite their experience, these scouts failed to gather definitive information about Victorio's current position. This intelligence failure highlighted the Apache leader's skill at concealing his movements when necessary. After 2 days of searching, the expedition discovered a large trail approximately 2 days old, heading toward Lake Santa Maria. This finding presented a tactical dilemma: follow the trail directly and risk ambush, or split forces to approach from multiple directions. Don Francisco chose the more cautious approach, dividing his force into 2 elements. One group would move along the southern slope where the massacres had occurred, while the other would approach the lake directly. This split-force approach reflected lessons learned from the previous disasters, prioritizing security over speed. As the expedition advanced deeper into the mountains, evidence mounted that Victorio's band had departed the area. The tracks showed a large group moving purposefully northwest, likely toward traditional Apache strongholds in the Sierra Madre. The expedition had arrived too late to engage Victorio directly. With the primary objective of confrontation now impossible, the expedition shifted focus to its secondary mission, recovering and properly burying the bodies of the fallen Mexicans. This grim task fell primarily to relatives of the deceased who had joined the expedition specifically for this purpose. The recovery teams discovered that the second rescue party had apparently found and gathered the bodies from the first ambush, placing them in a large rock crevice. Archaeological evidence suggests they had begun the process of covering these bodies with stones when they themselves were attacked and killed. This detail reveals a particularly cruel aspect of Victorio's strategy, allowing the second party to complete the recovery of the first before eliminating them as well. James B. Gillet later wrote in his memoirs that the scene of collecting the bodies was the saddest sight I have ever witnessed. The personal nature of this recovery, with fathers, sons, and brothers gathering their fallen relatives, gave the military operation an emotional dimension rarely captured in official reports. While family members searched for any who might have escaped, the main force moved southward to the primary water hole in Candeleria. This water source proved remarkably large and important, with sufficient water despite heavy use by both people and livestock. The expedition's scouts noted that control of this water source would have given Victorio's band a significant strategic advantage, allowing them to sustain a large force in otherwise inhospitable terrain. Approaching the water hole required extreme caution. Scouts were dispatched to ensure no Apache warriors remained hidden on the high rock walls surrounding the site. This precaution reflected the expedition's growing respect for Victorio's tactical acumen and unwillingness to fall victim to yet another ambush. The Texas Rangers explored the area that had served as Victorio's camp, discovering numerous hidden Mexican saddles, bullet-pierced hats, 2 damaged Winchester rifles, and other evidence including rawhide shoes and old moccasins. Most surprising was the discovery that the Apache had killed and eaten more than 75 horses and mules at this camp, an unusual practice that reflected either extreme need or, more likely, a strategic decision to prevent these animals from being recaptured and used against them. James B. Gillet took the initiative to climb to the peak of Candeleria Mountain, the spot where Victorio had positioned his lookouts. From this vantage point, Gillet gained a new appreciation for the Apache leader's strategic vision. The summit offered unobstructed views in all directions, allowing observers to spot approaching forces hours or even days before they reached the mountains. Standing where Victorio's scouts had stood, Gillet later wrote, I understood how thoroughly we had been outmaneuvered. From this position, nothing moved in the valley without being seen. Our approach would have been detected when we were still mere specks on the horizon. All recovered bodies were buried in the ravine where they had fallen. The expedition constructed stone cairns over the graves to protect them from scavengers and mark the site for future identification. These simple monuments would stand for decades as stark reminders of the tragedy. One of the most puzzling aspects of the scene was the condition of the bodies. Despite having been exposed to the elements for nearly 2 weeks in an area normally teeming with wildlife, no scavengers, neither predatory animals nor carrion birds, had disturbed the remains. This inexplicable circumstance added an eerie quality to an already somber situation. Some expedition members attributed this phenomenon to supernatural causes, while others suggested practical explanations, such as gunpowder residue or the specific manner of death deterring animals. With their grim mission completed, the expedition began the return journey to Isleta. The return trip passed without notable incident, though scouts maintained vigilant watch for any sign of Apache forces. The Mexican contingent shared their supplies with the Rangers when American rations ran low, a gesture of camaraderie that transcended national differences. Upon reaching Saraso, the expedition received a hero's welcome. The townspeople gathered at the church to offer thanks for the safe return of their men, a celebration tinged with grief for those from Cura who would never return. This religious ceremony reflected the deep Catholic faith that sustained many border communities through the hardships of frontier life. Though Victorio had eluded capture during this expedition, his freedom would prove temporary. Approximately 1 year later, he and 89 of his warriors met their end at the hands of Mexican forces under Colonel Joaquin Terrazas, referred to as Joaquin Terzas in some accounts. The Texas Rangers did not directly participate in this final battle, but they later eliminated a small group that had escaped and attempted to return to Texas. The double ambush at Candeleria Mountains stands as a powerful example of indigenous military expertise often overlooked in conventional historical accounts. Victorio's tactical brilliance, his ability to anticipate enemy responses, exploit terrain advantages, and execute complex operations with limited resources, deserves recognition alongside the better-known military commanders of his era. The story of Victorio and the 29 men who vanished in the Candeleria Mountains reveals much about the complex nature of frontier warfare. Far from the simplistic narratives often portrayed in popular culture, the actual conflicts involved sophisticated strategies, cross-cultural dynamics, and remarkable individuals on all sides. Victorio's tactical genius continues to fascinate military historians today. His ability to transform a simple horse raid into an elaborate trap that eliminated 29 adversaries without suffering casualties demonstrates military thinking of the highest order. Yet his story remains largely untold in mainstream historical accounts. The cooperation between Mexican citizens and Texas Rangers in the aftermath of the tragedy points to the complicated realities of border life, where pragmatic alliances often superseded national rivalries when facing common threats. If you've appreciated this exploration of Victorio's brilliant military mind, subscribe to Histories and Native Tales for more untold stories from the American frontier. In our next episode, we'll continue tracking Victorio's campaign across the borderlands as he evades the largest military pursuit of the era, with Texas Ranger James B. Gillet joining forces with the U.S. cavalry in a desperate race to prevent further ambushes.